At the turn of the century, there were a number of companies that were servicing the manufacturing and industry, and as the electrical industry formed, the American Fuse Company certainly had key customers. Many of those customers we still hold today as valued customers, but the roots go back to the American Fuse Company in Michigan.
Lynde Bradley was a very, very soft, polite individual. And Harry, I think, was probably a little tougher about most things. But I was always amazed at Lynde Bradley just to watch him, the way he get ideas. After all, he really created that controller without very much knowledge of electricity. And he told me about having taken one to a foundry. He wanted to sell them. And he was bragging that with that control, they could let a heavy weight down on the watch. You couldn't pull the watch out from underneath unless you lightened the load. It was, I thought, very educational because he didn't particularly like the foundries because they were so dusty and dirty in those days. But that's the way he sold the things. And then he got mixed up with that outfit in Michigan. That's when Dr. Allen came into the picture. He was their mother's doctor. And he could tell from her blood pressure that she was worried about something. And finally he got it out of her that this guy was trying to take their business away. So he called, as I understand it, a very reputable patent attorney in Chicago, and they got the patent away from this guy, got it back. Because this guy, I think it was the Michigan Fuse Company or something like that, and the guy was really going to run away with the business. It was just push buttons and standard starters. You had the resistors, potentiometers, and capacitors. The resistor business was, I would say, very, very outstanding.
Carbon composition resistors were a major part of this company for a long time. As Don Fitzpatrick used to say, they saved our lives for many years, during the war especially, World War II. And when I came, they were pretty close to 50% of our business. But we were selling quarter-watt carbon comp resistors for $100 a thousand, and within about 10 years we were selling them for $10 a thousand. We couldn't afford to build them here anymore. They were, once again, encased in this conglomerate plant across the street, and so we had to get out of here. The decision we should have made then was probably to recognize this is a mature business. Other technologies were taking over. We did recognize that.
There was a point in time we were making a capacitor on a ceramic substrate, and that substrate we bought from an outside manufacturer. I believe it was up in Canada. They had a labor confrontation strike for a period of time. That was our sole supplier, and so we needed to continue to make our product. So one way or another, we wound up buying that company, and we brought all the manufacturing down here. Part of what they made was an architectural ceramic as well, and you'll find it buried in various parts of this building. You'll find it on the walls in some places. You'll find it on the floors in other places. You'll find it in ashtrays sometimes, hidden away in corners. But we made architectural ceramic for a period of time, literally built a facility down along the lakefront here so that they could bring in the raw products, the silica and what they needed to make that that architectural ceramic and the ceramic substrates off of ships. We got out of that business when we finally quickly realized that we didn't have any great insight in either making architectural ceramics or selling that product. And it really, I think, goes back to saying, again, what we had mentioned before, that this company realized what it did well, focused on its customers. It didn't look to go out and spread its wings in many different directions, but really wanted to focus on its core competencies.
Our organization chart, right before I got here, Arloe did make some major changes there, but in Fred's time, the organization chart looked like the map of Boston, I used to say. You had the commons area in the middle, and everything came into Fred.
The man was incredible. I mean, he was first of all, I think in a lot of ways, he had a certain amount of commercial genius. I mean, he's the one that really established how our distributor organization would operate, so that we had the fewest number of distributors, yet serving the largest number of customers. And it was his thought and his idea that did that. He was the only one in the world like it at the time. So he was a commercial genius, but he was also very, very detail-minded and got involved in just about everything that was going on, including things like ashtrays. And
you see, Fred had the presidency for so long. He'd been with the company 57 years, you know. That's a hell of a long time. And there were some people that were upset about it, but if you looked far enough, there was some, I would say, jealousy in it, but I say the transition was very smooth. We didn't have any big problems from it. We probably had more squawking from the union than anything else.
One of the people, and the only person I know who remembers working for and knowing Lynde Bradley, is Arloe Paul. Arloe Paul was hired in 1933, in the midst of the Depression, out of Iowa State University. Started here as an engineer, worked directly with Lynde Bradley during his training program. And from that training program, even in those early years for salespeople, then was assigned to the Cincinnati office and was a salesperson in Cincinnati. From there, he moved up the ranks and eventually became the district sales manager for New York. And then from New York, we brought him back to Milwaukee, and he became president of Allen Bradley in 1967. And so Arloe Paul has a rich history for now 70 years, since he's 93 years old.
Arloe organized the company into, I guess it was 4 divisions. And it was the first step towards a management structure from the top.
Well, when you look at the Allen Bradley company, it's easy to make that decision. The different products are so different and so separated that I don't think there was any great shakes about that. Sure, I read about General Motors and some of the other companies that had divided into divisions, and some of them had trouble, and those things I tried to stay away from. Mainly it was to get everybody on the same team, and I think we had that.
Tiny Raider came in the same day I did, which joined the company in '68, and joined the Milwaukee operation in '68. He was in Canada before, but his vision and John Mason's vision was really to go with the automotives who were trying to promote a programmable controller, and he did a very nice job of that. It ends up that it's probably ended up half our business, and it was a real growth engine for us that allowed us to replace the business that we lost in the resistor market. And if you look at the company today, there are no electronic components in this business, and yet we're a strong, viable company.
Well, we set up a design team. Dave Ford led that team, and we wrote a functional specification for a new version of solid-state control, which ended up being card lock. I don't know if card lock's still remembered around here, but it was, we put the components on a card and they slid into a rack like the programmable controllers do now, except it was a smaller rack. Dave did his usual preliminary studies to find out what he thought it would cost and and how long it would take, and he kept coming up with 3 years. And I just said, Dave, 3 years is way too long. We gotta have something before then. But he didn't see how he could do it, and at the time, I think he was being a little cautious, maybe, but certainly smart, because we had not done this kind of thing before, so he was being careful. Anyway, I had a talk with Tiny about it, and told him that I knew of at least a half a dozen little companies around the country who were building this kind of thing at little systems houses. And we could probably make a deal with one of them, get a product, get going in the marketplace, because this concept is going to take a long time to sell to people who are used to using relays and used to being down in the rough shop atmosphere and just plain do not trust small, intricate little instruments.
I always felt that the future of the company was to obsolete your own products. And we had a good reputation for quality and so on and so forth, but the scope was limited. And I felt that solid state was the next big generation. So I thought we should do something there, but we never did anything. And then when I became president, I told the boys I wanted to see if we could find something that would fit into this factory automation business.
We thought, well, maybe we'd tinker around the edge of the company and we could just say change technologies and this, that, and the other, and that there would be very little drain on profits. But that turned out not to be the case. We did projections on how far we were behind other companies in the transition to either globalization or technologies or modern manufacturing, this, that, and the other. In almost every case, we were too far behind. So when you have a very successful company, you have more time than when you have an unsuccessful company. But we had challenges on both ends. We had to keep the company relatively successful financially, but we had to sacrifice some of that because for a 3 to 5 year period, we're going to drain profits by making this very dramatic change in the strategy of the company. And we had a board meeting and we went through this thing for literally 4 or 5 hours. Tom and Keith and I presented the thing, and it was just sort of marvelous. At the end of it, they all looked at one another and said, okay.
We began to see the old relay logic moving into more of the PLC, the programmable logic controller logic, and that was come out really out of Cleveland. Bud Whitney had a lot to do with that, and that era, that changeover from relays to programmable controllers was a major, major product improvement for what we have seen.
What we did was make a study of every electromechanical product we had, and TRIAs were in the power world, so I kind of include that in there, and tried to study the pace of change that was going to take place to move the majority of the technology from electromechanical, whether it was a limit switch going to a smart photo switch. But how long do we have to make that transition and get into the business, whether it was internal development, acquisitions, or whatever? Every one of those control features, to some degree, were going to be changed to solid state or electronics. And we looked at that, and everyone was slightly different, but we had time, and we were able to bring new people into Milwaukee and train younger people who were easily trained in these kinds of things. But we decided we better go after the computer business first. That was where the growth was going to be and the money was going to be made. And then we could flow backwards into Milwaukee and go after these more commodity-like products. They were not commodities, but they were more commodity-like products.
So I remember I sent Whitney and somebody else, I guess, Orman maybe, over to see this little outfit in Ann Arbor called Information Instruments, which made a programmable controller. And I think they had one installation in General Motors.
So we went, knocked on the door, saw the receptionist, Mr. Dutay, who owned the company, then came out, wanted to know what we were up to, and looked at us kind of askance and said he had to leave town the next day and really didn't have time to meet with us. So we said, okay, thank you. But in the process, another guy, Bill, can't remember Bill's last name. Bill, just had it, lost it.
Okay.
Anyway, he was sales manager, and it was his responsibility, of course, to sell this thing once they got it on the market. And he could see a great opportunity in making some kind of a deal with a marketing organization as good as Allen Bradley. So he encouraged us to come back the next day and talk with him about it. Dutay was going to be out of town. And John Dutay was out in Boston trying to get more money from the investment people to help him continue his work.
So you came back the next day?
So we came back the next day. He almost threw us out the first day. We came back the next day, found out who owned them. And to make a long story short, I talked to Tiny. Tiny made a couple phone calls. And these were small investors who were taking a risk, of course. And they were very interested in having somebody like Allen Bradley come aboard. And so we could buy 25% of them at that time. So that's how we got our foot in the door, really.
In those early years, the machine we had was PDQ-2, developed by Information Instruments Incorporated. There were two other companies that had programmable controllers at the time, and all three of these companies were basically funded by the Hydromatic division of General Motors to create this programmable controller. The other one was Modicon, and then the other was DEC. And DEC basically dropped out of the business after a while. Modicon and Allen Bradley were the two predominant ones, and of course Allen Bradley emerged to be the market leader in programmable controllers. At the time that we were beginning to market that product, we only owned about 40% of the Information Instruments Incorporated, and we saw at the time that the market was going to be for smaller machines than that 200 input-output PDQ-2, and so we recommended developing a smaller machine. The people in Ann Arbor said, no, you got to go bigger, and bigger is better. And this is where the falling out came, and our management decided to draw a line. Either you buy back our 40% and we'll go ahead and develop the smaller machine, or we buy you out. We ended up buying them out, and we went ahead and developed the smaller machine, and that's basically when Otto Struger and his team got involved, and there were several people from the engineering department that developed the smaller machine.
The promotion of it was, it's interesting, but we had a lot of help, and it took 5 years to get the world to begin to accept these things. We didn't write with black ink and programmable controllers until 1975, as I remember, and we started in 1969.
We had great engineers, so it's not the engineer's problem, but at that point in time, the solid-state electronic products just weren't good enough. And number one, and number two, you really didn't know things like fretting corrosion. What is fretting corrosion? Because a lot of this electronic stuff was new, the components, particularly in high temperatures like our environment was. And so there's a lot of learning that went on, and a lot of very successful learning went on. And I think that because one thing that we always said quality was in the logo and all that we really had everybody paying a lot of attention to those things.
That was the big job. It wasn't trying to tell us we were better than Modicon or better than DEC. It was trying to convince people that this was the way to go. And we had mixed emotions there too, because we loved our relay business, and this was obviously going to eat into that significantly. But it's one of those things that it's coming. You better be with it, and so we got with it.
Now, PDQ-2 was a very, very early one, and it didn't really have much successful sales. In fact, you could technically say we never actually sold one. We did have several in the field operating, but I don't think anybody paid for them. PMC was Otto Struger's invention from here in Milwaukee. So there was kind of this runoff between the acquisitions we'd made in Milwaukee, and the PMC, Programmable Matrix Controller, was one of the first successful PLCs we ever had in the field. And it was kind of a mix between hardwired solid-state logic, because the cards looked a lot like our old card lock stuff, and a programmable memory that you used EPROMs to program. And then shortly after that came the PLC. I mean, the thing that invented the name PLC. And it was the 1774 PLC, and it was actually our first big broadly successful programmable controller.
And that product came along at almost exactly the right time. It was almost too late. We had to start shipping it probably before we needed or should have, but that was the only way we were going to end up in the position of where we are. So there was a big risk involved in doing that, and myself and Walt Casto and Ted Schaller was part of that. We decided the risk was worth or the opportunity to win that was worth the risk.
Probably the most interesting thing to me was fundamentally when we became more and more aware of PLCs not just being a hardware product with a little firmware, but mostly the firmware product with a little hardware, and making that whole transition. And then I remember when I came back in 1992, they made all of us read this object-oriented programming. And I'm saying, what do I care about software programming for, or what this OOPS stuff is? What do I need to know that? And Hartel and Odo said, well, you got to know this because it's important. So I think one of the more interesting things to me is the way our business has changed in terms of the roles of hardware and software back and forth.
Odo Struger is really one of those people that for Rockwell Automation or Allen Bradley at the time really molded the company. So, he never became the president, but like Les Watson and his distributors and Fred Look and Odo Struger, those are all names that I think had extremely high influence on kind of what we became. Odo's very much was the technology focus. He gave us that leapfrog ability to bring technology to market before our competitors, and continually do what the customer asks us to do and migrate that technology forward instead of jumping from one platform to another. He was also very much the guy that understood users didn't work that way, and therefore we had to find a different way to get technology to market. So he was really one of our heroes.
Odo was a very, very unique individual. Very, very brilliant, very driven, very purposeful, and hired good people around him. And Odo really did the things that we needed to do, particularly getting engineering turned around and not just designing stuff, but making sure quality was designed in. But he could attract the talent and made sure that people were on step going forward. And Odo really would drive, one of those few people that had unique talents that could question the technical people, but also had the leadership ability, and was a great person beside it. So Odo was, a really unique individual, and I think had a great part, in Allen Bradley's history.
This is kind of an interesting little sidelight. I love the man. I mean, I thought he was just wonderful, but we were falling behind in some of the development, as we were prone to do. A lot of people were prone to do. It's hard to get that stuff done on time. But I called him in my office one day, and I said, Odo, I want to tell you something. If you don't have this PLC-3 done by the time that we've committed to do it, you know what's going to happen? I'm going to get fired. But you're going to get fired first. And he looked at me, and I think he thought I was serious. He looked at me, and he said, message received. And you know what? They did get it done on time.
We had to get the skills and expertise, and we had to understand that software-based things are very important to us as a company and important to our hardware business. We just had to understand that. And, it's hard to believe. I mean, because I grew up, when we programmed PLCs, back before PLC-3, if you had 5K or 10K of programming code, that's all you needed. Well, we all know now we can't even burp with that. But I think it was a real critical thing to get in our mindsets about just the role of software and what it was going to be going forward for us.
The Motor Control Center, which is under my responsibility right now, is really kind of a success story. We started out with very little market share, and it was decided that there were some things that could be done in the market to automate this business.
Well, Allen Bradley had a motor control center before then, but typical of what was going on around here, a customer would specify what he wanted, and we'd design it from Ohm's law, from the ground up. whereas everyone else had a modular type of control center where they could you could pick out catalog numbers and plug in size 1 starters, size 2 starters, or drives, or later on programmable controllers, whatever, into a basic control center unit, which could be shipped in modules. Ours was built up from the ground, and Tiny came from Canada, where control centers and high voltage starters were big. Were the biggest part of their market, probably. I'm not sure of that, but they were a big part at least. And he realized that that was not the sign of the times. Other people were going to be able to outrun us every time with the modular type of approach. So that's what was the genesis of the control center thing. And of course, we were in relays, and Fred or people around him were just simply not willing to accept this new logic control kind of thing. Westinghouse came out with SciPac in 1955. It used magnetic amplifiers, which saturable transformers, it should say, which you depending on how you energize or how you energize the magnetic field, would either have an output or have zero output. So they became a switch, 0 and 1. And they marketed that thing for 2 or 3 years, and then General Electric came out with another version, which was using transistors. And at that time, Westinghouse was trying to sell the idea of every competitor selling their SciPac, and they'd build it and they'd brand label it for you. And nobody really went for that, but everyone went home and designed their own, except Lynde and Bradley. Fred was bent on reed relays, which at the time were more acceptable to the marketplace. So we went heavy into reed relays, but they just never caught on because the solid-state stuff took that part of the market, the part that was not interested in having big ordinary relays.
They actually made standard products and started making configurators so you could put these things together in a standard way. And for something that normally took 8 to 10 weeks, we took the delivery on, right now we ship half of our business within about 6 days. And what that did was tripled the market share. So we got up to a certain point and we were very leveled off in the business in the late 70s. But once the quick ship programs and everything, it literally changed the playing field and tripled the market share, and now we've got the majority share in that market. So.
As we look at our product evolution, one of the key acquisitions we made was back in the 1970s as we were getting into the PLC business, and we bought a company in Ohio. Then we bought a drives company in Cedarburg, Wisconsin, and that got us into the drives industry, the paper industry, and the drives became a major part of it. And then as we acquired Reliance, that added to the drives business. But drives was one of the key acquisitions, along with PLCs, that we made during the era of the 70s.
We purchased a company, I think it was TPC, in Cedarburg, Wisconsin, and that's really where the roots were of this. And it was a kind of a slow progression, and they, again, the drives technology was kind of a technology that wasn't trusted. Again, the solid-state components weren't as reliable as they are today. But that business has grown significantly and has been a real boom to the company, and kind of given us another growth engine in the 90s, and it continues on.
The move from electromechanical products to solid state was going to be difficult for us. We knew that. We were known for unbelievable reliability. The electromechanical products that we had were the best in the world as far as reliability. And our customers were going to expect the same sort of performance out of solid-state products. That was not practical at that time. The technology in solid-state products was not going to allow us to do that. So we had to come up with solutions that we didn't have to worry about in the past. For instance, we didn't have a service organization per se. We had to develop a worldwide service organization where we could take care of these solid-state products in a way that we never had to take care of electromechanical products.
Back in 1980, I was asked to come in and be considered for a new position with Lynde and Bradley, and it was to be the National Field Service Manager. And in that position, I had a huge organization of nobody, just myself. And the objective was to really change a little bit the culture of Lynde Bradley from being from providing technical support services free through the sales organization versus an organized technical support group, because the product mix was changing so much with computer-based technologies and so on. And so the board had decided that there would be a free-to-fee change oriented through the company, and they needed somebody to head that up. Well, in the January of 1980, I was interviewed by Bill Younger and Don Watson, who was regional sales manager at that time, to consider a position of National Field Service Manager to implement that kind of a change in the organization. Well, Lynde Bradley was a premier organization. I was just delighted to be invited to consider that. But after looking at the conditions surrounding that kind of a change, I felt that I was not the one to do that. And I came up with an action plan of 9 steps, with the 10th item that I was not the man for the job, that they should get somebody internally in the company to do that. And so I declined the offer. Well, it was interesting that 6 months later, they invited me back to review what they had done with my 10-step program. Of course, I was like organizing that. Well, it was interesting. They had accomplished all the 9 steps that I had suggested and did it beautifully. And they said, and now the 10th point, we feel you're the one for the job.
As we became more and our mindset became more and more in tune with the solid state mnemonics and or not memory kind of thinking, computer thinking, we could see that there were great opportunities in having the financial computer and the purchasing computer and all of the other things up there work together with the shop floor. And that was the whole concept. So we devised these 5 levels, which at that time made sense. There may be fewer levels now, but, you know, the right foot's connected to the right leg, the right leg's
The pyramid actually started out as a rectangle, and that was because Bud Whitney, being an engineer, said, now you've got to find some way where I understand this, and the best way I can understand is draw me a picture. So Keith Nosbush drew this thing in rectangular form, and we started filling in all those little levels and then talking about how you had to have them communicate with one another. And we got very intrigued with it. The smart people in graphics turned it into a pyramid because the factory floors are much bigger, more and more people. Next thing you move up is less, the next thing you move up is less. And then at the top you have like host computers and then digital communication coming out of the top. It was actually like the Sphinx growing out of Mars or somewhere, and it had the pyramid, and then it had multi-levels in the pyramid. Each one had a name, and then had little people looking like they had specific responsibilities as they went up the pyramid. And then we, in the sidebars, we very briefly explained that and how that all had to be integrated to have maximum quality and maximum productivity.
Inside the company, and I'll give Larry DeLong the credit for this, he was the marketing director at the time for the PLC business. He had kind of created this 5-level hierarchical pyramid. And it showed kind of sensors on the bottom and then a plant floor control and the PLC at one level. Then it kind of had this layer that we call the cell level, which was multiple PLCs talking together. And then center and the top was called the plant level. Later it became kind of the enterprise level. Well, that simple 5-level pyramid became an easy way for you to get away from the technology and talk about how all this stuff fit together and made for a smoother running operation. And like a lot of things at Lynde Bradley at the time and Rockwell Automation since, a good concept that worked well inside to explain to our own management where we were going turned out to be something that worked extremely well outside.
One of the big evolutions we had was with the sales operation in Lynde Bradley. You know, all these district offices were little fiefdoms back in those days. And Fred told them what to do, and they did it. But other than that, they pretty much ran their own operation. And we felt we needed to have control of this because some of them, for instance, refused to sell programmable controllers until they were sure it worked. And so we got better control of that, began setting quotas, and that was an absolute no-no in this field organization. We almost had a revolution over that.
The sales force in this company was highly regarded. I think it's still highly regarded. It's one of our core competencies, I'd have to say. We have a very customer intimate relationship with our customers, and those are the things that work. IBM used to think they had the best sales force. They tagged their sales force the wingtip devils. Well, we had a little lower heels and we're loafers, but probably as good or better than the IBM sales force. And I wouldn't say we were on the border of cocky, but we probably were, and we're very confident of the products and the company and the backup of the company. You could get in trouble, the company would always bail you out and always bail the customer out and never let the customer hang. So those kind of things all molded together to make a sales force that was so confident that they built major market shares in the U.S. and North America.
There were people that came to the company. They were always, you grew up in the company was the vast majority of the people. And as the industry, as the competition changed, the inability to be able to operate in a changing environment meant that we had to understand different aspects of business than just what we found inside Allen Bradley. And so when I say professionally managed, I mean people that were managers, not necessarily grew up in the company. And the first part of that was when Glenn Gordon became president, and he brought in a number of people, Tracy O'Rourke's and others, who brought an ability to be very good managers and very good leaders, and brought experiences from other industries, other situations, and could help us become the type of company that we needed to be in a very changing environment. It was when the whole evolution of computers were hitting the factory floor. We were switching from being an electromechanical company to an electronics company, from one that was focused in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to one that had to have operations around the world and to really compete in a different environment.
When we figured out that we shouldn't kind of try to invent the computers because there were plenty of people that already knew how to do that, we needed to form partnerships with Digital Equipment, Hewlett-Packard at the time, a little bit of IBM at the time. They came a little later. And so it was kind of the beginning of our partnering activity as well. And at about that same time frame, we were starting to get some people to help us build some specialty modules for the I/O rack that did special things like integrated to vibration monitoring systems or weigh scales or even just serial devices. And that was kind of the birth of the Encompass program. So it was also in that time frame that we started to, and that was the late 80s and early 90s, we started to evolve in kind of the whole partnership program. Everybody from what we call strategic alliances with Digital Equipment and Hewlett-Packard down to Encompass partner programs and things of what we call the pyramid solution providers at the time, because we still had the pyramid thing going. And that was a part of our formal partnering activities.
World Contactor, that's probably the high spot in my career. I was a machine designer and joined here, went into the shop, supervised the machine building area, and what had happened at that point in time was that we were involved in the NEMA standard, the National Electrical Manufacturers Association standard in the United States. Our competitors were Square D and Cutler Hammer, pretty much, and they lived in this city along with us. So in the very, very beginning of the 80s, we began to see competitors coming in from Europe, and they were Telemecanique, Siemens, Klockner-Mueller, a number of those competitors coming in and selling motor starters of the IEC standard. which is the International Electrotechnical Commission. Well, the cost of those was quite a bit less than that of the NEMA standard, and rightly so, because the NEMA standard was very, very robust, much silver, replaceable parts. There was many, many benefits to the NEMA, which is true today. But the IEC standard came in, and folks like Telemecanique were knocking on our door saying, we can sell this thing at a lower cost than what you guys can with your NEMA product. So we took that as a wake-up call, and the wake-up call said we better get on to seeing how we could produce these.
But there were several ways we could attack that. We could go acquire a company in Europe. We could design our own. But once we came to the conclusion that we would like to design our own, then we had to find an extremely low-cost way of manufacturing those contactors and switches, if you will. And we were in the computer integrated manufacturing business. We were out there promoting that worldwide. It would seem like to us that if we had a factory that ran essentially with no people, no paper, no nothing, but put this stuff together all by itself, that would not only give us very, very low costs, but it would give us an example for our potential customers that this light assembly could be done in a peopleless, paperless, lights-out factory. But we couldn't go tell these people that that was a good thing to do if the investment was not justified financially. So we worked with Larry Yost and gave him the challenge that he had to come up with a way of designing this factory where it could just, like I said, it could just run lights out. You could get an order from Australia and you could make it the next day in the factory and nobody had to do anything. But it had to have a reasonable return on investment. It was interesting. What we found was that we couldn't have any inventory. If we had normal amounts of inventory turns, like 3 and 4 turns of inventory, that inventory added too much investment and it couldn't justify itself. So Larry and his team went back and redesigned the factory where essentially at the end of any production period, whether it was a day, a week, or a month, we essentially had no inventory. It was all pulled out of here, it was gone through the factory, it was put in boxes and shipped. And so we could erase that normal cost of inventory. That's what pushed it over the top. Otherwise, we would have not gone ahead with it.
The World Contactor Facility was the first fully computer-integrated manufacturing facility that would produce 600 contactors per hour to a batch of 1 and ship within 24 hours of the customer's order. It was a phenomenal achievement. And the World Contactor put ourselves on the map, so to speak, to say we can do what we're talking about. At the point before this, we hadn't really put our equipment all together into one large system. And at this point in time, when we had done that, we had proved to the world we can do it. And it is something that we want all of you to see. We want you to all come here, see what we've done, and then walk away with a very, very positive feeling that computer-integrated manufacturing is highly productive and it is also very, very profitable from the bottom line.
I guess if I had to point to the 2 things that are the most dramatically different from when I joined the company and what it's like today, I would point to the globalization of our business as one of them, and then the technology evolvement as the other.
The key factor in globalization was if we could justify the investment, we needed to increase the size of our available market very substantially. And one of the elements of that was obvious to us was the global markets where we had very low market shares.
And when I started, we had an agent in New York running our whole international business, and he had a bunch of sub-agents, shops around, sales operations around the world, and that was it.
We used every technique that you can think of in order to go after our globalization plan. We bought companies, we did grassroots kind of things, we did joint ventures, everything you can think of, any technique you could think of to penetrate markets, going direct, buying distributors, all of them were used throughout the world. There was not a single plan for the world, there was a plan for every country on how we were going to do it, in every market and every product on how we were going to do it.
We went where our customers were going. We made sure that we could take care of our customers as well in Tianjin, China, as we could in Cincinnati, Ohio. And if we could do that, we knew our customers would stay with that. Plus, it's so much harder to sell in some countries, like in Germany with Siemens, going in and selling toe-to-toe, that's tough. But if Procter & Gamble is putting a paper plant in there, selling that paper plant, that's a little bit different. So we would try to figure out where could we have the edge and how do we utilize our strength. Rockwell Automation started because we brought Reliance, and Reliance Electric was an opportunity that came up because Reliance Electric and another company were going to merge, and this was the first, as we would say in business, an unsolicited offer. Other people would say hostile takeover. But this is the first unsolicited offer we ever had the opportunity to do. And we looked at it from several perspectives, but one allowed us also to get some mass a lot more, plus not just focus on the industrial market, but look at some other kinds of motors and mechanical products. So, I looked at that, and that was one of the main things because we were able to do that and do that well. It really, I think, helped with what Don Beal wanted to do vis-a-vis kind of spinning off some different parts of the company because he had a strong base, and we couldn't figure out what do we want to call it. We want to call the Reliance Electric and, the branding stuff. Do we want to call that Allen Bradley? And so I remember going back and forth with a lot of people then about what do we do. And then we said, well, let's just call it Rockwell Automation, keep the brand stuff. So that's where a lot of that came from, was back then, because we paid about $1.1 billion or $1.5 billion for $1 billion plus for Reliance. And then we couldn't just say, well, we'll just make that Allen Bradley now.
Today, it really isn't about what is the absolute best product and how fast does it run and does it do every single function that I want. It's about what does it do for me from a business standpoint as far as our customers are concerned. And so where we're headed today and what we're doing today is becoming a lot more involved in helping our customers solve those business problems they got, whether it's higher quality, less downtime, time to market, faster throughput, higher productivity, lowering cost, reducing assets. We're all about trying to help our customers do that today. And that's the right place for us to be right now. And probably it's going to be the right place to be for a long time. It may be how we do it will change as time goes by, but that will always be an important thought. And based on the fact that what we do collects up a lot of data and information from plant floors. That's valuable. That's valuable information, and the ability to provide that in ways that make it useful to customers enormously important.